Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up a topic that is, frankly, a really critical historical inquiry. We're going to be focusing on the internal challenges faced by a new nation, Pakistan, during its most fragile, formative period.
Exactly. And we're not looking at a war fought on a border or some external pressure. This is a tragedy that unfolded, really, inside the political system itself.
That's the core of it. We're talking about the collapse of constitutional discipline in early Pakistan.
It's a profound study. And, what makes this period so compelling for anyone who studies governance is that it's just such a powerful cautionary tale about institutional integrity.
Cautionary tale, I like that.
Yeah, because we're looking at a system that failed not from a lack of resources, not from a lack of talent, but, well, from a failure of character. We're diving deep into the sources that analyze this collapse of constitutional morality, specifically between 1948 and 1956.
So our mission for this deep dive is pretty straightforward. We're going to extract the key insights from an authoritative work, Quaid-e-Azam of Pakistan. It's written by a constitutional and corporate lawyer, Zahir Ahmad Mir.
And it's important to note, this book isn't just a history, a timeline of events. It is a sharp, surgical, constitutional critique of the country's first decade. It really gets into the why.
Right. And the author lays out the central premise almost immediately. The decline of this nascent state was, as the analysis suggests, fundamentally a self-inflicted wound.
Precisely. Myanmar argues that the primary culprit wasn't, some external enemy or overwhelming global pressures. No. The core of the problem was an internal decay.
Driven by what, exactly?
A fatal mixture of moral failings. The source calls it a trifecta of hypocrisy, ambition, and irresponsibility within.
Hypocrisy, ambition, and irresponsibility. That's a powerful indictment. And that really is the tragedy we're zeroing in on, isn't it? The fact that the spirit of the law, this sort of moral commitment to building a nation, it died before the physical written law could even be properly adopted.
It died before it was even born, in a sense.
Yeah. So we need to unpack how. How did that death of discipline actually manifest? So let's start with the very idea of constitutionalism itself. Okay, so when we talk about a constitution, I think the image that comes to mind for most people is this, massive leather-bound rule book.
Right. The official document.
Full of articles, schedules. It feels very mechanical, very administrative. But the analysis we're exploring today, it defines it in a much deeper, almost emotional way.
And that mechanical view is precisely what allows systems to fail. The source is very clear. A constitution is far more than just paper. It calls it a moral promise.
A moral promise.
Yes. And a covenant of justice, discipline, and accountability. If you think about it as a covenant, it demands a reciprocal commitment. It's a two-way street between the governed and the governing.
That distinction is so vital, isn't it? The written document is the map, okay, but the constitutional spirit, that's the commitment to actually follow the map.
Even when it's politically inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient.
Exactly. If the leaders operating the system don't internalize that moral promise, that commitment to justice over, say, self-interest, then the paper just becomes window dressing. It's meaningless, no matter how perfectly drafted the clauses are.
And this brings us right to the original, crucial contribution of the founder, Jinnah. He embodied constitutionalism as a lived ethic. The legal analysis is crystal clear on this point. It says Jinnah gave Pakistan the spirit of constitutionalism even before its written constitution existed.
He lived the law before the law was written.
That's the line. That's the essence of it.
So what does that mean in practical terms? I mean, how did he actually embody this constitutional discipline? What did that look like day to day?
Well, it was a behavioral template. It was a model that prioritized institutional rigor over personal power. Despite being the Quaid-e-Azam, the great leader with immense personal authority, he consistently set precedents for strict adherence to process.
You give us an example.
Sure. Even as Governor General, a position of significant power, he constantly reinforced the supreme authority of the Constituent Assembly. He understood, fundamentally, that the institution, the democratic process, had to be stronger than any single personality.
Including his own.
Especially his own. His leadership was also just marked by this incredible fiscal prudence, a deep respect for minority rights, and an unwavering, almost stubborn commitment to legal procedures. That behavior, that discipline, that was the true constitution for the first year of the nation's life.
But then, almost immediately after Jinnah's passing in September 1948, the analysis details this profound behavioral shift.
A vacuum. And indiscipline just rushed in to fill it.
And it wasn't a slow creep, was it? The source suggests it was almost an instantaneous decay of that constitutional spirit.
It really was. The post-Jena vacuum allowed the system to immediately turn inward on itself. And it's so critical to grasp this. The spirit died long before a comprehensive written constitution could even be finalized. We see the political class and the bureaucracy almost at once begin to prioritize their own sectional and personal imperatives over that national vision Jinnah had enforced.
And the material gives us very clear, specific symptoms of this decline. This wasn't just some vague mismanagement. It was a structural erosion caused by a change in moral behavior.
Absolutely. The first major symptom was how power shifted. The analysis points to the bureaucracy starting to manipulate policy.
How so?
They started subtly at first, but later very overtly seizing decision-making power. So instead of elected representatives driving policy and the civil service implementing it, you had the implementation class, the bureaucrats, starting to dictate the political direction.
That's a fundamental inversion of the democratic order, isn't it? The unelected structure starts calling the shots.
It's a complete inversion, and at the same time, the politicians, the very people who should have been reinforcing democratic control, they failed to push back. And why? Because they were distracted.
Distracted by what?
They began pursuing personal advantage, securing their own ministries, shoring up their own regional power bases, making their own private alliances, anything but focusing on the monumental and frankly difficult task of making a constitution.
So you have a system where the administrators are maneuvering politically.
And the politicians are just focused on their own personal survival.
Exactly. And the source says the ultimate sign of this moral failure was that the national interest. It consistently, time and again, took the backseat to self-interest.
Which is the functional definition of constitutional betrayal. That covenant of justice we talked about, it demands that the national interest is paramount. When self-interest, whether it's personal gain, sectarian loyalty, or just factional survival, consistently overrides national imperatives, the promise of the Constitution is fundamentally broken.
And this really establishes the premise for our entire deep dives today.
Yes. Documents are functionally useless without the collective moral character and disciplined conduct to uphold them. The failure wasn't just legislative. It was ethical. It was a failure of character.
The foundation was laid not by some external attack, but by a conscious decision within the governing class to abandon the painful, difficult discipline that constitutional leadership requires. It's a harsh, but I think necessary starting point for understanding everything that followed.
Right. So moving into 1949, the newly formed Constituent Assembly takes its first major crucial step. They adopt the Objectives Resolution. Now, on its surface, this looks like a pure act of nation building. Oh, absolutely. It was intended to be the spiritual and intellectual framework for the nation, the guiding philosophy. The analysis confirms the intention behind it was pure. This document was supposed to synthesize the democratic ideals of the new state with its unique cultural and religious identity.
Okay, so let's look closer at those principles, because they are absolutely crucial to understanding the betrayal that comes later. The resolution was built on 4 major pillars, right?
That's right. And the principles were, they were incredibly lofty. First, you have the recognition of God's sovereignty, which meant that any authority exercised by the state's representatives was a sacred trust.
So accountability was baked in from the start.
It's inherent in the power structure. Second, there's this explicit assurance that fundamental rights, equality before the law, freedom of expression, must be protected for all citizens, not just some, all.
And the third,
and this is critically important for a diverse new state, was the guarantee that minorities must be fully safeguarded. They had to be able to freely practice their religions and develop their cultures without fear. It was a holistic vision, really, aiming for an inclusive, just, and accountable democracy.
it sounds, just as the source describes it, like a beautiful declaration.
It was.
So if the spirit of Ginny's discipline had prevailed, this resolution would have acted as this unshakable moral compass, guiding the entire constitution-making process responsibly.
But here lies the central heartbreaking tragedy of this moment. We immediately transition from this noble intent to the grim reality of principle misuse. The analysis states with startling, really blunt directness that the Objectives Resolution was tragically abused.
Right. I think we need to slow down and really define that. How does a foundational declaration, a text meant to unite, become a tool for division? This is where political opportunism really shows its cynical face.
It's what happens when you decouple principles from morality. Instead of seeing the resolution as a comprehensive moral framework that demands unity and justice for everyone, Certain factions started treating it like a political menu.
A menu.
Yeah, they just extracted the elements that served their own self-interest. They began selectively interpreting the religious and ideological elements to consolidate their own specific power agendas.
So, for example, instead of using the principle of divine sovereignty to enforce universal accountability for everyone, they used it to justify imposing their own specific interpretations of state ideology.
Precisely. This weaponization had an immediate and incredibly corrosive effect. The analysis points out it was deliberately used to weaken parliamentary unity. By pushing these polarizing interpretations, especially around the state's religious identity, you create friction right where you need consensus.
So it made the already arduous task of drafting a constitution based on compromise nearly impossible.
Utterly impossible. The Constituent Assembly quickly descended into a battleground over ideology instead of a constructive debate over, say, governance structure, which is what they were supposed to be doing.
And the long-term result was that instead of this being a unifying document that set ground rules for every citizen equally, it created deep ideological divisions. It just exacerbated the rifts that were already there between different regions and political camps.
It went from being a statement of national purpose to the source of political gridlock and conflict. And ultimately, all this maneuvering, the selective interpretations, the inflammatory debates, it was all deployed to justify short-term power games.
So the moral depth of it, the parts requiring justice, equality, protection of minorities, that was all lost.
Completely lost in the scramble for immediate political advantage.
And this detail is so crucial for you, the listener, to grasp. The objectives resolution was a profound moral document. But by becoming negotiable, by being thrown into the political marketplace, its value as a moral framework just evaporated.
The quality of the principles matters far less than the moral character of the people who are supposed to interpret them. The principles became a convenient cloak. The leaders leveraged the loftiest statement the state had produced, but they stripped away its moral substance and reduced it to just transactional political currency.
The integrity of that foundational moment was sacrificed for cynical gain.
And that set the stage for the total character crisis of the next 4 years.
So the stage is now set for these critical years between 1950 and 1954. This is a period where constitutional development didn't just slow down, it effectively stalled. The original mandate was to quickly finalize the Constitution, build strong democratic mechanisms.
Right. Get the country on its feet.
Instead, the focus became purely internal political maneuvering.
This period is the clearest manifestation of that absence of constitutional character we've been talking about. If the objectives resolution was a fight over high ideals, the 1950-54 period was characterized by almost petty, mundane struggles for survival. The vacuum created by the lack of constitutional discipline was filled by political ego and just pure short-sightedness.
So what were these leaders actually focused on during this 4-year window? The analysis shows an institutional focus that was entirely inward-looking and transactional.
They were consumed by it. They were consumed by maintaining their personal power structures, often at the direct expense of national stability. The focus was obsessively on securing ministries, the immediate gratification of being in office.
Right. Perks of power.
And playing a constant game of forming and dissolving alliances to check your rivals, whether they were real or just perceived. Personal loyalties and regional factional support became the ultimate currency. It completely eclipsed merit or national competence.
So the goal was no longer about completing the Constitution.
No. The primary goal shifted to immediate political survival, just getting through the next week, the next month.
That sounds exhausting, and certainly not conducive to long-term governance. This is the moment, according to the analysis, where systemic corruption and constitutional manipulation really took root. This is the definition of the state's character crisis.
It's where the rot became institutionalized. You saw the undeniable rise of factionalism, where political groups prioritized their own clique, often along geographic or linguistic lines, over the broader welfare of the Federation.
And that was coupled with rampant favoritism, right?
Absolutely. Rampant favoritism in appointments, in resource allocation. Meritocracy just collapsed. It was replaced by loyalty tests. It wasn't about what you knew, but who you knew and who you were loyal to this week.
And underpinning all of this internal warfare was what the source calls constitutional manipulation. And we get specific here. What did that manipulation actually look like in practice?
It meant actively bending or delaying or sometimes just flat out ignoring established rules for political gain. For example, the constant intentional delays in finalizing the draft constitution. That was an act of manipulation.
How so?
Well, it was often done through something called the Basic Principles Committee. If you can delay the fundamental rules of the game, you maintain the flexibility to operate in this gray zone, which allows those in power to maintain control without any real democratic accountability.
So they weren't building the state.
They were playing chess with its foundation.
This era prompted that powerful, definitive judgment from the source, one that I think encapsulates the entire tragedy we're discussing.
I know the one you mean.
Pakistan's tragedy was not that it lacked a constitution, it lacked constitutional character.
That sentence is the core thesis of the entire analysis. The leaders had the raw material. They had brilliant minds, they had foundational documents like the Objectives Resolution, they had a clear mandate from the people. But they lacked the discipline, the moral courage to submit their own self-interest to the overarching interests of the state and the law.
They didn't need a new law.
They needed a renewed commitment to ethical behavior in office.
And we see the profound real-world consequences of this moral failure in the administrative dysfunction that followed. I mean, governance simply ground to a halt while the politicians were preoccupied with their games.
The analysis provides concrete, almost depressing evidence of this administrative decay. Legislative and cabinet meetings were constantly delayed, sometimes for months at a time.
Which means crucial policy decisions were just left hanging.
Decisions about the economy, about infrastructure, about defense, all just hanging. There was no continuity. And any decisions that were made were often inconsistent, they were reactionary, and they lacked any kind of cohesive, long-term strategic planning. They were just putting out political fires, not building a national infrastructure.
It paints this picture of a governing class entirely consumed by internal political skirmishes, while these huge national challenges, poverty, national integration, security, were consistently ignored.
That is the functional failure of a constitutional collapse.
So by the time we reached 1954, constitutional morality hadn't just declined.
Yeah.
It had, in the words of the source, completely collapsed.
It had. The entire political environment was now primed for institutional failure because the mechanism for self-correction, that basic commitment to the rules, was broken. And this set the stage for the moment when the crisis moved from a moral failing to something much worse, a formal, fatal legality.
The stage is grimly set for an inevitable constitutional clash, and it arrives violently in 1954. This event is identified as the first major constitutional betrayal. This is the moment the collapse moved from being a moral tragedy to a formal legal catastrophe.
This is the pivot point. The years of character erosion made this dramatic assault not only possible, but, you could argue, predictable. When the political class refuses to govern by the rules, they invite intervention from forces that operate outside those rules.
And this was the Governor General's assault, specifically the move by Governor General Ghulam Muhammad to disband the Constituent Assembly. What made this action so egregious, so profoundly unconstitutional?
Well, the Constituent Assembly was the sovereign legislative body. You have to understand it was both the provisional parliament and the constitution-making body. It was the embodiment of the people's will.
So for the Governor General to disband it
Unilaterally, by himself. It was an act of executive overreach that just directly violated the core principle of parliamentary sovereignty. The Governor General was a figurehead. His position was largely ceremonial and historically subservient to the elected body. The analysis labels this quite rightly a direct attack on the parliamentary foundation Jinnah had built.
Jinnah had explicitly established that parliamentary democracy was the core of the state. So this action, it didn't just sideline a group of politicians. It sought to legally dismantle the fundamental democratic structure of the state itself.
It was, and I'm using the stark terms from the source here, the first open assault on democracy. And it was the exact moment when constitutionalism formally died.
Formally died.
Yes. Up until this point, leaders had ignored the law or they delayed it. In 1954, the law itself was murdered by executive fiat. Ghulam Muhammad claimed he had emergency powers, essentially arguing that the assembly had failed to produce a constitution and governance was impossible. That was the justification.
Which brings us to the moment that has the most devastating long-term implications. The critical role of the judiciary in this crisis. They had the chance to act as the bulwark, the defender.
And this is where the tragedy acquires its fatal legal teeth. The judiciary, the last remaining institution theoretically committed to defending the Constitution and the rule of law, it failed spectacularly.
Instead of rejecting the Governor General's illegal act,
They validated it. They gave it a stamp of legal approval.
so they took the executive's claim of necessity and they gave it legal sanction. They essentially confirm that when political conditions are deemed chaotic enough, the executive can unilaterally just toss out the legislature.
Exactly. The court's decision hinged on recognizing this illegal act under what essentially became a localized version of the doctrine of necessity. It's the idea that extraordinary measures are permissible to restore order, even if those measures violate the Constitution itself.
And this is the critical aha moment that the analysis stresses, isn't it? This single judicial judgment became the damaging foundation for every future derailment of democracy and constitutional processes.
It's the original sin, legally speaking. If your highest court confirms that the executive can dismantle the legislature and that necessity justifies unconstitutional action, well then every military leader, every strongman who follows, knows they have a legal precedent to justify their own coups and interventions.
It's a get-out-of-jail-free card for autocrats.
It created a toxic doctrine of convenience, one that fundamentally subordinated the rule of law to the demands of political power and administrative stability. Once that judicial bulwark is breached, the constitutional system loses its primary defense mechanism. The moral death that started in 1948 was formally registered and validated in the legal system in 1954. The Constitution was declared legally disposable.
So despite the profound chaos, despite the systemic betrayal of 1954 and years of infighting, the political process somehow limped on. 2 years later, Pakistan finally adopts its first formal written constitution in 1956.
It finally happens.
But the analysis makes it very clear that this constitution was essentially doomed from the moment it was signed.
It's a textbook example of closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. The document was intended to create stability, but the environment it was born into was structurally, fundamentally unstable. You can't impose a rigid structure onto quicksand and expect it to hold.
So explain why the 1956 Constitution was so inherently weak, despite finally delivering that written framework everyone had been waiting for.
Well, the weaknesses really fall into three critical areas. First, and maybe most importantly, the timing was just fatal.
Too little, too late.
Way too late. The moral foundations had been thoroughly dismantled by 8 years of corruption, manipulation, and the blatant unconstitutionalism of 1954. The Constitution was introduced into a political culture that had already internalized factionalism, favoritism, and that judicial validation of executive overreach. The system had already learned that rules were optional.
Okay, so timing was one. What was the second weakness?
Secondly, the document itself was inherently flawed. After years of these ideological battles over the objectives resolution and just constant political horse trading, the structure of the 1956 text was weak. It was compromised in its principles.
So it was a document born of exhaustion, not inspiration.
Exactly. It was a document of exhausted compromise rather than unified vision. It tried to satisfy too many competing factions and regional demands, and the result was a text that lacked the necessary structural firmness. It didn't have the kind of unambiguous safeguards needed to withstand the political volatility that was already commonplace.
For instance,
It failed to provide a really robust separation of powers that could truly check executive aggression, the kind of aggression that had just dissolved the assembly 2 years earlier.
and the third, most critical point,
It was completely overshadowed by the existing, undisciplined political culture.
the culture ate the Constitution for breakfast.
You could say that. A new set of written rules means absolutely nothing when the governing class, the civil service, and even the judiciary have already demonstrated a profound lack of respect for the rule of law itself. The constitutional text was fundamentally incompatible with the political reality of 1956. The document prescribed democracy, but the culture practiced power games.
The source uses a really powerful analogy here, the fortress analogy, to summarize this structural flaw.
It's a brilliant image. The analysis states, a constitution built without moral foundations cannot become a fortress of justice.
Unpack that for us.
Well, think about a fortress. It's designed to be strong, to withstand sieges, to protect what's inside. If the foundation, the discipline, the shared morality, the commitment to institutional integrity, if that is missing, the walls will just collapse under the first real pressure. The fortress offers no protection to the rights, the processes, or the institutions it claims to uphold.
And this inherent weakness explains why its collapse was so incredibly swift. The 1956 Constitution lasted a mere 2 years. It was abrogated in 1958.
Just 2 years. It didn't even survive long enough to embed itself into the nation's political consciousness.
The speed of its failure is really the ultimate confirmation of the source's central argument, isn't it?
It is. It did not collapse because the written text was, intellectually flawed, though, as we said, it had its weaknesses. It collapsed because the political instability and the revolving door of leadership proved that the spirit had already died. The foundational character required to sustain constitutional governance simply did not exist by 1958, leading directly to the country's first imposition of martial law.
So the failure wasn't a legislative oversight that could be fixed with an amendment. It was a cultural and moral bankruptcy that preceded the document's arrival and ensured its swift demise. Hashtag tag outro. Host speaker and expert speaker. So this detailed deep dive into the 1948 to 1956 period, it reveals a tragedy that's rooted so deeply in character and institutional neglect. The core lesson from Zahir Ahmad Mir's work seems undeniable. The early constitutional collapse of Pakistan was not some accident of history.
Not at all. It was a direct and, you can argue, measurable result of political leaders and administrators collectively abandoning the ethical discipline and legal fundamentals that were established by the founder.
One's self-interest, factionalism, and just raw ambition took the place of national duty.
The state lost its moral and institutional ballast. It was adrift.
We started by defining a constitution as a moral promise, and the history we've just walked through shows us exactly what happens when that covenant is treated as a disposable tool by the very people who swore to uphold it.
It reiterates a crucial lesson, and one that I think transcends this specific history. A written constitution, however perfect the text may be, however robust the rights it grants on paper, it cannot save a nation when its leaders fundamentally refuse to live by constitutional morality.
The law only protects the citizens if the leaders are disciplined enough to protect the law.
Even when, especially when doing so, costs them personal power.
It's a powerful and, I think, timeless observation. If the foundational text of a nation is useless without the moral character to uphold it, then the true security of any state lies in the integrity of its governing class.
Indeed. And this leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to explore as you consider this history. If the spirit of discipline and accountability is the true safeguard of a nation, what contemporary institutions might be suffering from a similar death of character?
You mean institutions today?
Anywhere in the world. They could be political, social, or even corporate. Think about institutions where the legal documents, the mission statements, the founding principles, they all remain perfectly intact on paper. But the actual moral commitment required to sustain them has quietly eroded from within.
A thought for you to mull over. What is the relationship between institutional structure and individual character?